This is Jocko Podcast number 155 with me, Jocko Willink. On the island, the dead were piling up. In the mission report, the head of the convoy wrote, "At 2 p.m. on May 20th, I went to the island of Nazino with Commander Tepskov. There was a terrible scramble, people crowding and fighting around the bags of flour. Dead bodies everywhere, 100 or more, and lots of people crawling about and crying, 'Give us bread. Boss, it's been 2 days since we've been given anything to eat.' They're trying to make us die of hunger and the cold." They told us that people had begun eating the dead bodies, that they were cooking human flesh. The scene on the island was dreadful, appalling. On May 21st alone, the 3 health officers counted 70 additional dead bodies. In 5 cases, they emphasized, the liver, the heart, the lungs, and fleshy part of bodies had been cut off. On one of the bodies, the head had been torn off along with the male genital organs and part of the skin. These mutilations constitute strong evidence of cannibalistic acts. In addition, they suggest the existence of serious psychopathologies. On the same day, May 21st, the deportees themselves brought us 3 individuals who had been caught with blood on their hands and holding human livers. Our examination of these 3 individuals did not reveal any extreme emaciation. And there's an elderly local peasant woman who reported the things we saw. People were dying everywhere. They were killing each other. There was a guard named Kostya Venikov, a young fellow. He was courting a pretty girl who had been sent there. He protected her. One day, he had to be away for a while, and he told one of his comrades, "Take care of her." But with all the people, the comrade couldn't do much. People caught the girl, tied her to a tree, cut off her breasts, her muscles, everything they could eat. They were hungry. They had to eat. When Kostya came back, she was still alive. He tried to save her, but she had lost too much blood. She died. That was the kind of thing that happened. When you went along the island, you saw flesh wrapped in rags. Human flesh that had been cut and hung in the trees. And that right there is from a book called Cannibal Island by Nicholas Worth, who's written books about communism. I think his most famous is the Black Book of Communism. And Cannibal Island specifically breaks down one of the small individual nightmares of the Soviet gulags. But the nightmare was not small, and it certainly was not specific. It was widespread, and it was broad, and it was almost incomprehensible, and very little about it would be known were not for one man, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who not only survived the gulags but lived on to write incredibly detailed and very well-researched books about the gulags. Some of them were fictionalized, like A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, and for the good of the cause, but most comprehensively in his 3-volume tome, The Gulag Archipelago. And this series is a massive series, and it's been cut down to an abridged version that was actually approved by the author himself. And the abridged version has just been re-released in Europe with a foreword by a man that I think repopularized that book, a man that is here today to discuss that book and, among other things, I'm sure, a man that I needed to give an introduction to the first time he was on this podcast, but now who needs no introduction whatsoever? A man by the name of Dr. Jordan B. Peterson. Jordan, thank you for coming back on.
That was a rough beginning, Jocko. Jesus.
Yeah. I remember when I started listening to you, you would say something along the lines of that, we are quite capable of creating hell for ourselves as human beings. And that, clearly, that situation, I don't know. I mean, that's hell.
Yeah.
And
close enough.
Yeah, and it's created by us. It's created by us, which I think is obviously horrific. And the Gulag Archipelago.
It's Kafka. Yeah. Well, that's why I hate to see the kangaroo courts emerging all over the West, and with the universities sort of at the forefront of that. So we're building these alternative court systems constantly that don't follow standard legal procedure, and it's really, we're messing with things that we shouldn't be messing with. And yeah, there are accounts, I believe it's in the Gulag, of applause after a Stalinist speech, right, where people would stand up and applaud, and they'd applaud until literally the old people were falling over, because if you were the first person to stop applauding, then you were it was off to the camps with you.
No, he absolutely outlines it. So that sounds so crazy to say. And he outlines a specific thing that happened. It's that right there. No one will stop applauding because they're afraid they're going to get ratted out by everyone else. Yeah, well,
and by the people who are in fact watching. And I mean, by the collapse of East Germany, 1/3 of the people were informers for the state. And so if you had a family of 6 people, 2 of your family members were direct government informers. And it's creepy in some sense. It's a very weak word to use in this situation. But when I was at New York University talking to Jonathan Haidt about, it was about a few months ago, he just wrote that book called The Coddling of the American Mind, and he took me into one of the men's washrooms there, and there was a poster on the wall asking students to turn each other in for instances of bias or offensive speech. And they have a whole bureaucracy that's designed to do nothing else but adjudicate these instances of biased speech. And these posters are up on the walls as if this is something to be proud of. And the same thing is happening now in Scotland, where the Scottish police are doing exactly the same thing. They're asking citizens to turn each other in for hate crimes, and the problem with that is, the fundamental problem with that, and the unsolvable problem is, well, who defines hate? And where's the line drawn? It's like, well, anything that upsets me that you say is hate. And then it's worse than that. It's like, what happens is the people who define hate end up being those who are looking to take offense so that they can find someone they can define as a victimizer, so that they can persecute them morally and justify that inner sadism. And those are the people who end up defining the laws. And then they mask this with the morality, saying, well, we're doing this to make our society a safe place. It's absolutely dreadful. And to see that happening in the UK it's just awful. Because, the UK is a center point of the idea of free speech. A lot of American ideals. America's a great center of free speech, but it's a variation on the English system. So to see that happening in the UK it's awful. And to see the police doing this and being encouraged by the politicians, and to see this put forward as some sort of moral action, it's just, well, it's an echo of this kind of catastrophe that we're discussing.
So I think about that sometimes, and I also have a tendency to look at things and not be too worried about them.
Mm-hmm.
Like, hey, come on,
yeah.
What's really going to happen, right? And that's actually part of my personality, and part of that comes from my old job where, hey, I can't worry about these little things. Oh, there's some little problem going on over there. That's not going to affect us. It's not going to, and you got to pay attention a little bit, make sure it doesn't get out of hand. But that thing about speech, and you just mentioned the kulak. Is that how you say it?
Kulaks,
Kulak.
Yeah. They were the Ukrainian farmers who were good at farming.
When I read this part, it got me worried about my own personal lackadaisical attitude towards things that I think, oh, that's not big of a deal. Mm. Let me read this little section about the escalation of the word kulak.
Yeah,
and where it started and where it ended up.
Yeah, that's good.
So here we go. In Russian, a kulak is a miserly, dishonest rural trader who grows rich not by his own labor, but through someone else's. In every locality, even before the revolution, such kulaks could be numbered on one's fingers. And the revolution totally destroyed their basis of activity. Subsequently, after 1917, by a transfer of meaning, the name kulak began to be applied to all those who in any way hired workers. Even if it was only when they were temporarily short of working hands in their own families. And that doesn't stop there. The inflation of this scathing term kulak proceeded relentlessly, and by 1930, all strong peasants in general were being so called. All peasants strong in management, strong in work, or even strong merely in convictions. The term kulak was used to smash the strength of the peasantry. And I gotta go a little bit further because
hell of a thing for the Workers' Party to do, eh?
Crazy.
Yeah.
They went further though. Beyond this, in every village, there were people who in one way or another had personally gotten in the way of the local activists. Mm. This was the perfect time to settle accounts with them of jealousy, envy, and insult. These are the people you were just talking about. A new word was needed for these new victims as a class, and it was born. By this time, it had no social or economic content whatsoever, but it had a marvelous sound. Podkulakchnik. And that meant a person aiding the kulaks. In other words, I consider you an accomplice of the enemy.
Yeah.
And that's all it took.
Yeah, well, one of the things I tried to outline in my foreword to the abridged version was I was thinking about this idea of, oddly enough, about intersectionality, which is a social justice idea, that the social justice idea is that we're best defined by our collective identity, and that the proper narrative in relationship to our collective identity is one of victimizer, which is a replay of the old Marxist doctrine of bourgeoisie and proletariat. It's just in its new guise. And that new guise developed at least in part in response to the Gulag Archipelago, because the old proletariat bourgeoisie distinction became morally untenable. So it just went underground and underwent this transformation. The intersectional theorists point out that your status as a victimizer or a victim is actually the intersection of your multiple identities. And that's actually the Achilles heel of the collectivist notion, and we can get into why that is. But there's a horror that goes along with that's not obvious, that I think contributed to exactly why the Russian Revolution went so horribly wrong. And that is that, so imagine that I could characterize you along 5 or 6 different dimensions of group identity. It's pretty easy. You're male of a certain age, you're male of a certain age and economic class, you have a certain sexual orientation, you have a certain ethnicity, you have a certain race. That's 6 groups right there. And we could continue. You know, your parents had a certain socioeconomic class, and so did your grandparents. And then your ethnic group had a certain privilege or lack thereof. And you're attractive or you're not attractive, and you're intelligent or you're not intelligent. And there's temperamental variability. And like there's all sorts of ways of characterizing you according to your group. Okay, now we might say that if we were compassionate people, that we would take one of those group identities or more and look at where you're dispossessed and victimized. Okay, and we're going to find some dimension along which you're less privileged than some people. Like maybe you come from a working class background despite the fact that you're like a straight male. And so you can be a victim on that dimension. And that's at least in part an element of intersectional theory, right? And that maybe your oppression is the product of your multiple victim-like identities. But that can easily be reversed, because it's absolutely the case that I can take any person and I can do a multidimensional analysis of their group identities, and I can find at least one dimension along which they're the perpetrator, not the victim. They're the victimizer, not the victim. And as soon as I can identify a dimension along which they're a victimizer, then that justifies their persecution. And so one of the things that you saw happening in the Russian Revolution, and it's very much akin to what you just described, was that the borders of who was validly accused of being a victimizer essentially expanded to include everyone.
Yes.
And that's actually right. It's in a perverse sense, it's right. Because if you position yourself properly in the historical flow, then you should see yourself as a perpetrator and a victim equally. Well, it's not the right way to see yourself at all, but if you're going to play that game, you're going to be on both sides of it. And then the issue is, and this is related to your idea about, you know, in your platoon, you've got one person who's sadistic. It's like, okay, well, let's even assume that at the beginning of the Russian Revolution, that the vast majority of the people who were motivated by communism were actually compassionate with regards to the dispossessed peasantry. Now, I don't believe that, but we could say that was even a significant minority. Well, the
what
question
percentage
is,
did you just say on it? What was your hypothetical percentage?
Well, let's say it's 20%, or
Fair
let's
enough.
even say it's 50% of people who are genuinely motivated by compassion for the dispossessed. But then there's another minority, maybe we could even say it was only 10% to begin with, who weren't motivated by that at all. They were motivated by the jealousy and the spite and the resentment that Solzhenitsyn describes. And they were the ones who were after those to be persecuted. And the thing is, they got the upper hand really rapidly. And it might be because the carnivorous types, the predatory types, are much more dangerous and powerful than the compassionate types.
Yeah,
like they'll take them out instantly.
We're willing to step up and smash someone,
Yes.
as opposed to the people that are saying, "Oh, we just want to help."
Yes, exactly. Well, and there's someone I actually cited, a guy named, I think his name was Walter Latsis, in the foreword, who wrote in a journal called Red Terror that if you were interrogating an enemy of the state, you didn't bother with niceties like their individual guilt. That was a bourgeoisie conceit. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind. What you wanted to do is to do a class-based analysis and find out, well, are they a member of, let's say, the Kulak or the affiliates of the Kulaks, which is a lovely way of expanding your list of potential victims, and then you execute accordingly. And that would mean, well, the person that you're interrogating, right, or the class member that you're interrogating, and then their children, and perhaps also their grandchildren. And Latsis himself was eventually executed by the Stalinists. Somebody wrote to me after I wrote the foreword and told me that was his eventual fate. And I thought, well, talk about standing on a chair and putting the noose around your own neck and kicking it out from underneath you. It's like, he murdered himself. Fundamentally, and you could say in some sense that was the story of the Soviet Union to a tremendous degree.
Yeah, there's one part going back to the ever expanding people that need to be destroyed. There's a point in the book where he's saying, hey, look, there's insects. Stalin's describe, or maybe it was Lenin was describing these certain people as insects that need to be destroyed, and then he just starts off with, hey, people that are rabble rousers, they're insects. And then it just expands and expands, and then it's got priests, and then it's got engineers.
Oh yeah, and physicians.
And physicians.
Oh yes,
like
everyone. Wreckers.
Yeah, wreckers.
Wreckers.
That's the word that they use, or that he uses in the book for basically saboteurs.
Yeah.
And that expands beyond comprehension.
Yeah, because
that every single problem that there is the fault of some person out there that's sabotaging.
Yeah.
And they do this show trial, and he talks about it in the book. For I think the phrase that he uses, or that they used, that the Soviets used, was organizers of the famine. Meaning like, you're starving, and these people over here, they're the reason these are the people that organized the famine. They're the wreckers of production of food.
You bet. Well, it was either that, you imagine that you adopt a worldview, and that worldview enables you to, at least in principle, organize yourself with other people and to provide you with a certain amount of psychological stability. And then things go dreadfully wrong, and then you have a choice, which is to reevaluate your worldview, which is, of course, what Solzhenitsyn does in the Gulag Archipelago in a very deep way, is reorganize his entire worldview. Or you can look for reasons why you're right and these things are happening. And Solzhenitsyn talks a lot in the Gulag Archipelago about, he had a moral conundrum when he was in prison, and he started his moral awakening, let's say, and he was trying to figure out how to treat other people who were imprisoned. He had a real moral conundrum when a committed communist was dragged into the Gulag system, which happened all the time. He said those people were in particularly dire straits because not only had they been subject to the entire tyrannical weight of the deceitful state, but it was at the hands of their own comrades and friends. And then the committed communists would enter the Gulag, and they would still be in their morally superior phase, right? That their incarceration was a mistake, and that things would be set right, and that there was nothing wrong with the system, and they would attempt to justify it. And Solzhenitsyn was never sure how to react to these people ethically, because on the one hand, well, they were devastated because now they were political prisoners, and maybe they got a 20-year sentence, and they were in terrible, stripped of their family and just ruined. But on the other hand, they were still avid supporters of the very fist that had crushed them. And so his eventual conclusion was that until they broke and repented, they weren't to be allied with. They were still essentially on the side of the perpetrator. And it seems to me that's right. That's unrepentant sin, let's say. And it isn't until you, what would you say? Until you take responsibility for your own complicitness in your unfair interrogation that you get to join the ranks of valuable and suffering humanity again. And so, yeah, it's the extension of the persecution is really something that's horrifying, to see how who constituted a victimizer, the ranks of who constituted a victimizer just grew and grew and grew. Well, no, you can't make this stuff up.
You can't make it up.
No. Did you see, I believe that movie was The Death of Stalin? Did you?
I did not see it.
But that's worth seeing, because it's very interesting, because one of the things about that movie is that it captures that surreal element, because it's a black comedy, and there are comical things happening in the movie in that terrible, dark way constantly, at the same time that in the background genuinely terrible things are happening. So it's that horrible, it's got that horrible satirical flavor that runs through books like the Gulag Archipelago, where you think, well, this is so absurd that there's no possible way it could have occurred. And yet that's, not only did it happen, there was like a contest to top the absurdity. To consider the engineers, for example, wreckers, is, well, these people were building the Soviet system to the degree that it was built, and then to turn around and accuse exactly those people of being the ones who destroy and undermine it. It's part of, I really think that what underlies this, whatever this is, and I think this is what manifests itself in the worst of the leftist collectivism, is a real hatred for anything that smacks of competence at all. Like, I tried to imagine those Russian villages, because I come from a small town, a small northern town too, so I tried to imagine that you're in an isolated village, and it's a peasant village, and the peasants weren't freed that long ago, right? They were basically serfs until about the the middle of the second half of the 19th century. And so they had been emancipated. And then some of those people who were emancipated got a little bit of land and started to have a life, started to be successful peasants. And they were also the people that grew the bulk of the crops, because what you see happening in any productive domain is that a small percentage of people do almost all the productive work. So there's a small percentage of productive farmers who grew all the crops, right? And then there's all sorts of farmers who were only farmers by name and they weren't successful at all. So there was a certain relationship between being productive as a farmer and developing some wealth. Maybe you had a house and maybe you could hire a person or two, and which you'd think would actually be a good thing, especially if you were also growing food. Okay, so you imagine you get a village, and now there's a bit of a socioeconomic pyramid, and there's some people that are doing well, and it isn't the crooked people that are really annoying. The people who, like the genuine kulaks, let's say, that small percentage of psychopathic types who were basically profiting criminally off the efforts of others. Those aren't so annoying, those people, because they're rich, but they don't deserve it. And so they don't stand towards you as a moral ideal that shames you. But the really annoying people are the ones who are doing well and deserve it, especially if you're someone who's doing nothing and is bitter. Okay, so there's the village, and you've got your people who are doing all right, and then you've got a huge strata of people who aren't upset about the people who are doing well. They might even admire them and be happy that they're around because they're making the community thrive and growing some food. Then you have this little strata at the bottom of people who are ne'er-do-wells and on the more psychopathic end of things, and they're bitter and resentful and waiting for their bloody opportunity. And then the communist intellectuals come into town and say, those people that are doing well, they actually, everything they've got is ill-gotten, and they stole it, and they stole it from you, and look at how badly you're doing. And the reason you're doing badly is because these people who are lording it over you and who have all this creature comfort, they took that from you. It's yours by right. And that's part of that victim-victimizer narrative. It's just, and you can imagine that. You can imagine a dark night. You can imagine the winter. You can imagine the alcohol. You can imagine the rage that fuels these people who are drinking too much in the pubs that have been sitting there for the last 20 years, like, what would you say, eating up their own souls with resentment and bitterness. And then someone comes in and says, you're the true victim here, and here's the people that you can go after. And then, if you play that on your imagination, you get some real sense of exactly what sort of horror that would produce. Unbelievable.
Yeah, and I think he spells that out very clearly, and he says it's, what he's saying, I'm saying that you got a psychopath in your platoon. He's saying that psychopath, all that psychopath needs to flip is someone to tell him that that's the right thing to do. And that's exactly what happened when you said that's it. Those guys that were slightly psychopathic.
Yeah.
And then it becomes, okay, I'm the head psychopath, and you're in my village, and let's say you're one of those people that are in the middle. Well, whose side are you going to be on? I'm a psychopath. If you're not on my side, I'm going to kill you next.
Yeah.
So you go, well, no, I'm on your side too.
Yeah.
And that's how it expands indefinitely.
Well, and it doesn't take, look, it's not like it takes much pressure on people to have them fold. I mean, one of the things you see happening right now in our culture is that's happening to people all the time with these Twitter wars. Someone will say something, they'll express an opinion, and then they'll get mobbed but only abstractly, right? It's not like there's pitchfork wielding mobs at their house. And I'm not making light of it. It's no pleasant thing to be mobbed on Twitter. But that's an abstraction compared to these people showing up at your house, and what'll happen is that people will go through an abject apology, and they'll say, well, I really didn't mean it, and now I understand what my privilege is, and I see how what I said could have been very hurtful to people, and they wander through that entire apology and fold almost instantly. And that's under almost no pressure compared to what real pressure is. And real pressure is when the wolves are actually at your door rather than just barking off in the distance. But people will fold just when they're barking in the distance. It seems to me to be the case. And I think that this is part of the ethic that's embedded it's deeply embedded in Christianity, with the idea that the idea that the ultimate sacrifice that you can offer to the world is the sacrifice of yourself. It's like, well, imagine that you have to sacrifice something to set the world right. Well, you do, obviously, because you have to give up things now in order to make things better in the future. So the sacrificial idea is a very deep one. Then the question might be, well, if you're going to sacrifice something, is it going to be someone else or is it going to be you? And I really think that's the fundamental question. And the right answer to that is that it's going to be you. It's your fault, right? You take that on, or at least you take on that responsibility.